Good evening. Welcome to the first presentation for the spring of Landmark College's guest speaker series. Before I introduce you to tonight's speaker, I just want to mention that there will be a presentation, the next one on March 3rd at 7 p.m. here, of Sanjuka Ghosh, and the topic is of burqas and bikinis, Afghani women and the war on terror. So that's coming up on March 3rd. Dan Miller joined the faculty of Landmark College as assistant professor and religion, assistant professor of religion and philosophy in the fall of 2012. Dr. Miller received his PhD in religion from Syracuse University in 2010. His research interests include the intersections of religion, secularization, and political theory, theory and method in the study of religion, 20th century continental philosophy, and modern Christian thought. He has presented papers at numerous academic conferences, including the American Academy of Religion, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Society for Religion, Literature, and Culture. He has also published articles in the peer-reviewed journals Political Theology, Method and Theory in the Study of Religion, and the Bulletin of the North American Paul Tillich Society. His recent scholarship efforts have been primarily directed toward the completion of his first book manuscript, The Secular in Question, Religion, Politics, Democracy, currently under review for publication with Duquesne University Press. The material for tonight's talk is drawn from the opening chapter of the manuscript. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Miller.
Jeff suggested that I aim for about 40 minutes-ish, which that should be about right. And I apologize, I do have to write out papers. If I don't, my students will probably attest that I can wander, and we would be here till 9 o'clock. So my topic tonight is essentially when religion is politics. And I'll start with an event that isn't so recent anymore, but relevant. On January 16, 1979, Shah Mohammad Pahlavi of Iran left the country on vacation. That was the official reason. He was going on vacation. It was not, as we all know, really a vacation. He was abdicating power. He never returned to Iran. On January 31st, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned to Iran after 15 years of exile, greeted by crowds of supporters possibly numbering in the hundreds of thousands or even the millions. And by February 11, 1979, the remaining Pahlavi regime collapsed, and the army surrendered to the revolutionary group rallied around Ayatollah Khomeini. The Islamic Revolution of Iran was complete, and is actually this week, they're celebrating their 35th anniversary of the Iranian Revolution. These events took observers in the United States, who was the primary foreign player in Iranian events at the time, almost completely by surprise. Anyone reading accounts from the months immediately following the Iranian Revolution cannot help but be struck by the repetition of this theme. No one saw it coming. Zbigniew Brzezinski, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his name, I've done it my whole life, was National Security Advisor in the Carter administration, suggested that even as late as the end of October 1978, the collapse of the Shah's regime still had not come into view for the U.S. and other Western observers. Indeed, President Jimmy Carter had recently described Iran under the great leadership of the Shah as, quote, an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world, end quote. U.S. and other Western observers struggled to grasp how a government that had been viewed as the most stable in the Middle East and a great bastion against the spread of communism could collapse so rapidly. The failure to predict the Iranian Revolution is noteworthy for a number of reasons. First, given the significance of Iran for U.S. foreign policy at the time, the U.S. had a vested interest in predicting events in Iran. Some observers went so far as to say that the U.S. loss of Iran as a regional ally was as significant as the then recent defeat of the U.S. in Indochina. This failure of prediction is further accentuated by the fact that all the precursors necessary for predicting the fall of the Shah could be discerned by 1977. And with the advantage of several decades hindsight, to us, the Iranian Revolution seems positively obvious. Of particular interest this evening, while I'm talking about this, Religion's role and its significance in the Iranian Revolution particularly took Western observers by surprise. Again, in retrospect, the role of religion should not have been surprising at all. The Iranian mullahs had been cultivating anti-Shah sentiment for the 15 years that he was in exile, resulting in a mass movement opposed to the Shah's regime, which is exacerbated by the regime's estrangement of religious leaders. As numerous commentators also suggest, there was also a specifically Shia Islamic dimension to the revolution. And indeed, religious appeals even marked the Shah's regime. The Shah claimed repeatedly that the hidden imam, a sort of messianic figure within Shia Islam, had appeared to him. He claimed the religious authority of an Ayatollah, and he consistently paid homage to Shia Islam as the state religion of Iran, stressing that the reforms he imposed were in keeping with the dictates of Islam. In the post-mortem analyses of the days, weeks, months, and years following the Iranian Revolution, then, it became increasingly clear that these events were neither unforeseeable nor unintelligible, a point which was particularly true with regard to its religious dimensions. This is even more apparent if we look back again from the 21st century. From our perspective, there's no missing this. These considerations present us with a couple of questions that I want to consider tonight. This is where I want to sort of go for the next few minutes. First, given the obviousness of hindsight, why were the events surrounding the Iranian Revolution, and particularly the central role of religion in these events, experienced as unforeseeable or unintelligible? Why didn't we see the Iranian Revolution coming? And the "we" you could put in quotes, and sort of fill that in various ways. Second, and related to this, how did geopolitical movements and events like the Iranian Revolution, by which I mean geopolitical movements that are global in their significance and articulated in explicitly religious terms, force us to rethink our received understanding of concepts such as religion, politics, secularism, and so forth? The first of these questions, why we didn't see the events coming, is relatively easy to answer, at least briefly. We didn't see them coming because they cut against the grain of the theoretical perspectives that structured modern political and international relations theory. Our failure to anticipate the Iranian Revolution reflects a kind of theoretical blindness, or a cataract that occluded our view. George Lansowski illustrates this and is worth quoting at some length. He writes, "In terms of essentials of political power, the Shah appeared to hold all the trump cards. He had full control of the organized state machinery, exercised direct command over the impressive military establishment, had a ubiquitous security apparatus, and enjoyed unprecedented wealth from oil revenues. According to the political laws of the 20th century, an authoritarian system was not supposed to succumb to civilian revolution short of a lost war with foreign powers." End quote. The theoretical blindness to which I referred has to do with these so-called political laws of the 20th century. While post-mortem analyses highlight the significance of religion for the events that culminated in the Iranian Revolution, they also illustrate one defining feature of these so-called political laws of the 20th century. They allow no role for the social significance of religion. The political theoretical norms to which Lansowski alerts us are constitutively secular in nature, with the result that religion represents a crucially significant theoretical blind spot. The secularist assumptions dominating the international relations theory virtually ensured blindness to the theoretical and practical significance of religion as a socio-political force. As the international relations theory Elizabeth Shackman Hurd notes, what has come to be termed the global resurgence of religion, for which the Iranian Revolution serves as a kind of paradigm example, represents an analytical difficulty precisely because it does not fit into existing categories of thought governing academic international relations theory. In fact, as she points out, the very language of religious resurgence reflects specifically secularist presuppositions. Such language presupposes that religion and politics are inherently discrete, mutually exclusive social categories, reflecting the presumptive political authority of secularism. Stated somewhat differently, such language presupposes that politics is properly or inherently secular in nature. This will not be surprising to anybody familiar with social or political theory. As Scott M. Thomas notes, the modern social theory from which international relations derives sought to explain away religion, not to account for it. He notes that modernization theory, which remains the conventional wisdom of international relations theory, accords only a very specific and very negative role to religion. Modernization theory has been constitutively secular in nature, and with particular regard to the question of politics, has predicted the disappearance of religion from the public square. Additionally, modernization theory insisted that publicly engaged religion was a defining feature of traditional societies, which could confidently be differentiated from modern societies. Bringing these points together with the assumption that modernization represents a linear, progressive, and universal theory of social change, the logic rendering the Iranian Revolution unforeseeable is clear. Religion simply was not supposed to play a central role in effective mass political movements, let alone full-scale revolutions. According to the logic of modernization theory, religion can only be interpreted as a fundamentalist or anti-modern reaction to the inevitable and inexorable spread of modernization and globalization. The Enlightenment elevation of rationality, upon which both secularization and modernization theory are predicated, itself requires, in Roxanne Euban's words, the creation and subjection of an irrational counterpart, namely religion, and even more specifically, publicly, socially significant religion. On a secularist model, then, religion operates as the irrational other of the modern West, which, for its part, purports to show the rest of the world its own secular future. Accounts and analyses from the time of the Iranian Revolution commonly reflect precisely these assumptions. This is particularly true with regard to the accounts offered by some of the key players in developing U.S. foreign policy at the time, a number of whom wrote memoirs and things following the Iranian Revolution. Brzezinski's memoir is rife with such examples. He suggests that perhaps the Islamic fundamentalist wave, as he calls it, was simply too overpowering to be countered, and poses the following as one of the fundamental questions opened up by the events surrounding the revolution. Quote, how to maintain and encourage from the outside political stability in a traditional but rapidly modernizing state, end quote. He highlights the traditional versus modern binary numerous times throughout his account. His disdain for the presumed irrationality of the religious actors in the revolution is also clear. For example, he dismissively writes of the challenges posed by religiously aroused masses and radicalized urban youth. Expressing similar reductions of the revolution to irrational mob psychology, John Stemple attributes the success of the revolution to the blending of theocratic ideology with mob power. Barry Rubin, summarizing the contributing factors to the revolution, suggests that the religious actors in question are essentially anti-modern in orientation, a point explicitly echoed by Stemple as well. Reflecting both the assumption of mass psychology and primitivism, Clyde Mark opines that, quote, emphasizing religious values may be a way of combating the confusion arising from the transition from an ancient to a modern society, and suggests that the revolution's orientation around Islam was successful because Islam provides simple, direct, and proven answers and appeals to the masses. The truism that socially and politically significant religious articulation must be epiphenomenal in nature, must reflect true movements, also makes frequent appearance in these analyses. Linsowski describes the way in which, quote, national, economic, and territorial conflicts are aggravated by the intrusion of religious positions, with the obvious implication that the significant role of religion in the revolution could only be an irrational, epiphenomenal indicator of deeper and more significant social processes. Francis Fitzgerald states, against all evidence, that, quote, the uprising in Iran was almost entirely spontaneous, end quote, insisting that it could not have been controlled or coordinated by religious leaders, and suggesting that it represented merely the coalescence of popular passions around a majority religion. In her estimation, the opposition to the Shah represented nothing more than a mass following lacking any definite political shape. While Walter Z. LaCour represents a relative exception insofar as he predicts the ongoing significance of Islam as a political force, a prediction we know has played out in spades, he can still only imagine the religious actors as xenophobic and intolerant fundamentalists who must ultimately be the pawns of some other, presumably non-religious political force. Further highlighting this theoretical blindness, many commentators at the time insist that the left, influenced by Soviet communists, simply must have been the primary actors in the revolution. Illustrating this point, Yahya Armajani notes that, quote, in addition to fundamentalists, communists offered media pundits their most readily available answer concerning the cause of the revolution. He goes on to quip that members of the intelligence community failed to predict the revolution because they were all communicating with the ghost of Joe McCarthy, seeing communists and Islamist Marxists behind every slight criticism of the regime. Bill points out that Brzezinski consistently believed that the opposition to the Shah consisted of communists on the left and a few reactionary religious leaders on the right, thereby maintaining a consistently Soviet-centric, that's his term, perspective. Likewise, Robert Heiser, the American general sent to Iran to observe and advise in January 1979, radically underestimated the influence of Khomeini, consistently articulating the view that the communists were ultimately behind the religious leaders. This sentiment is also evident in the widespread assumption that the organized nature of opposition to the Shah was such that the Soviets must have been pulling the strings. Lacour suggests that while the left played only a modest role in the downfall of the Shah, its ongoing influence can nevertheless not be ignored, and poses the question of whether or not Khomeini might ultimately have been manipulated by the left. Accounts to the contemporary to the events also attest to the widespread assumption that the specifically religious dimension of the revolution would render it anomalous, which is to say that the revolution would be short-lived. And while we know that a lot of changes happen in Iran, the revolution has not been short-lived, as the anniversary they'll celebrate tomorrow, I think it is, shows. Elaborating this position in stark and painfully Orientalist terms, Stempel insists, quote, the nationalist and religious ideology of the Islamic militants who took over legitimacy and power in February 1979 offers neither the organizational capacity to manage nor a philosophical or ideological program that will have long-term appeal to the majority of the population in Iran. And he insists that rejecting modernization is unlikely to remain a viable policy. Reiterating both this point and his primitivist understanding of Islam, he writes, and this is sort of a breathtaking statement to me, in time-honored Persian fashion, 2, 5, or 7 years ahead, circumstances will favor a new man on horseback, a new Reza Shah. End quote. Statements such as these vividly illustrate Thomas's point that modernization theory provides a way for Western policymakers to see religion as a short-term problem of national security and to avoid taking cultural and religious pluralism seriously. So, all of that in view. To sum up our considerations to this point, the secularist assumptions underlying modernization theory created a kind of theoretical blind spot, which largely accounts for the failure of Western observers and analysts to foresee and account for the Iranian Revolution. I now want to turn our attention to a fuller consideration of notions such as secularism, secularization, and their relation to these events. And again, I'm using Iran as an example. We could multiply it with a lot of other examples. In describing modernization theory as secularist in its orientation, what exactly do we mean? Or at least what do I mean? There's no real agreement on secularization, so I guess it's just me. To bring this issue into view, I want to draw a distinction between secularization and what I will be calling normative secularism. While the two concepts are often conflated, a number of scholars hailing from diverse disciplinary and theoretical backgrounds have highlighted that these terms are not straightforwardly equivalent. Stated most basically, secularization, as I use the term, is descriptive, while normative secularism is, as the term indicates, normative and predictive. The concern of secularization is with the degree to which, or indeed whether or not, the social significance of religion has declined. While there has been intense debate concerning whether or not or to what extent secularization is taking place within societies, my concern is with the concept of normative secularism and the significance of developments such as the Iranian Revolution in evaluating it. If discussions of secularization seek to describe the existing role of religion within the social, normative secularism states what the social role of religion ought to be. A wide range of scholars recognize the essentially normative force of secularism. To give just a few examples, Jacobson and Pellegrini define secularism as a discourse that invokes powerful moral claims and evinces manifold political effects. Elizabeth Shackman Hurd describes secularism as a form of political authority, and Talal Asad suggests that secularism is a concept with a political doctrinal content. Normative secularism, as I use the term, refers to a universalizing narrative which has structured Western modernity, we've already seen this connection, and which, precisely as universal, has had a normative status. As such, normative secularism presumes to lay out the nature of rationality, modernity, and the political as such, which flow together toward a common end, the extreme marginalization, if not the total disappearance of religion from those areas of human experience. So turning now to this concept of normative secularism. We can begin to better understand the notion of normative secularism, by considering the secularization thesis, which, as Assad notes, has always been at once descriptive and normative. A consideration of the secularization thesis is also useful because it has served as the main theoretical and analytical framework through which the social sciences have viewed the relationship of religion and modernity. And this is true if you're looking at sociology, even psychology of religion, political theory, political science, international relations theory. Receiving its most standard articulation by sociologists of religion, primarily in the 1950s and 1960s, the secularization thesis became the reigning dogma of the field by the 1970s. Anybody who studied social science or the social sciences in the 1970s will have known this, will have experienced this. The sociologist Peter Berger nicely sums up the thesis, which has no single authoritative form, by writing, quote, "The idea is simple. Modernization necessarily leads to a decline in religion, both in society and in the minds of individuals," end quote. And it's worth noting, Berger's an illustrative case. Anybody who's studied the social sciences know that Peter Berger was an early founder, an articulator of the secularization thesis, and he has now come to refute it. He now thinks that current events have proven the thesis wrong. So he's this interesting figure who's done a full 180 on secularization theory. Roy Wallace and Steve Bruce, defenders of the secularization thesis, stated this way, stated briefly, I'm quoting, "The secularization thesis asserts that modernity brings in its wake the diminution of the social significance of religion, where social significance seeks to capture the extent to religion makes a difference to the operation and standing of social roles and institutions and to the beliefs and actions of the individual." In other words, they argue that secularization means religion will become less important both socially and publicly and to individuals as society modernizes. We should take care not to be misled by the seemingly descriptive tone of these formulations. The secularization thesis harbors a deeply normative component. This is because descriptive claims concerning the public and social role of religion lead to predictive claims about the future role of religion, which are themselves heavily coded by claims about how secularization has come about. Evaluation of the secularization thesis therefore demands that we attend to how it explains the changing social significance of religion. Such explanations are most easily presented in narrative form. William Connolly is one of a number of scholars who offers a helpful illustration, and again, I'm going to quote him at length because he just gives a nice statement of this. This is his sort of narrative of what I'm calling normative secularism. Quote, "Once the Universal Catholic Church was challenged and dispersed by various Protestant sects, a unified public authority grounded in common faith was drawn into a series of sectarian conflicts and wars, so-called wars of religion. Because the sovereign support of the right way to eternal life was said to hang in the balance, these conflicts were often horribly destructive and intractable. The best hope for a peaceful and just world under these new circumstances was institution of a public life in which the final meaning of life, the proper route to life after death, and the divine source of morality were pulled out of the public realm and deposited into private life. The secularization of public life is thus crucial to private freedom, pluralistic democracy, individual rights, public reason, and the primacy of the state. The key to its success is the separation of church and state and general acceptance of a conception of public reason, or some surrogate, through which to reach public agreement on non-religious issues." End quote. Connolly's formulation highlights a number of issues that bring us to a fuller understanding of normative secularism. The first is the conceptual linkage of secularism with the Enlightenment critique of religion and emergent rationality. Following the Enlightenment, historical developments with regard to secularization were coded as the reflection of unfolding reason, reason with a capital R. That is, the secularization of European society following the so-called wars of religion came to represent not a historically contingent or pragmatic response to religious conflict, but the unfolding and triumph of reason over against religion as irrationalism. In this process of secularization, religion is socially constructed as a reality essentially distinct from secular social activities such as politics and economics. As the sociologist Jose Casanova suggests, through the experience of the Enlightenment and the wars of religion, modern Europeans learned to separate religion, politics, and science. Most importantly, they learned to tame religious passions, and note the sarcasm of his voice here. They learned to tame the religious passions and to dissipate obscurantist fanaticism by banishing religion to a private sphere while establishing an open, liberal, secular public sphere where freedom of expression and public reason dominate. Not only is this emergence of the secular nation-state with its rational sphere represented as a fulfillment, even if only a partial fulfillment, of human reason, we see that it is also, in Scott Thomas's word, part and parcel of the political mythology of liberalism, highlighting what William Cavanaugh refers to as the soteriological or salvation-based concept of the modern nation-state. He writes, and again I quote at length, but some of these people are better at saying this than I am, quote, "The state, the liberal or secular state, is needed to save us from the cruel and violent consequences of religion." Again, I'm trying to capture it as sarcasm. "The modern state, the privatization of religion, and the secularization of politics arose to limit religion's domestic influence, to minimize the effects of religious disputes, and end the bloody and destructive role of religion in international relations. Thus, the political mythology of liberalism is the myth of the modern secular state as our savior from the horrors of modern wars of religion or clashes between civilizations." There's a nod to Samuel Huntington's thesis. End quote. Here then, secularism, rationality, liberalism, and the state are all articulated as our salvation from religion. On this normatively secular account, religion represents an irrational and dangerous impulse which stands in distinction to rational secular forms of power. Fundamentalism, in turn, is the result of the failure to maintain this distinction, thereby allowing irrational religions to overflow their boundaries within the private domain and to take an illegitimate public form. This view of normative secularism also brings us back to modernization theory. The narrative of our secular salvation from religion is not simply the narrative of Europe's salvation. Rather, it is the very definition of what it is to be modern, not merely for Europe, but for the world. This narrative, as Casanova notes, it is so intrinsically interwoven with all the theories of the modern world and with the self-understanding of modernity that to question it is necessarily to question the category of modernity itself. In Grace Davies' memorable phrasing, secularism assumed, among other things, that whatever characterized Europe's religious life today, including secularization, would characterize everyone else's religious life tomorrow. As we have seen, the connection between secularism and modernization is explicitly articulated, which lays the path open to the complete transformation of the economic, social, cultural, political infrastructure of developing countries, representing the policy expression of the normative secularist expression of the state. As Casanova remarks, the story of secularization was embedded within an even broader narrative of general teleological processes of social modernization and progressive human development. Modernization and secularization therefore represent the linear and universal telos, or end, of the social. While the secularization thesis may purport to be descriptive and value-free, then, in reality it defines not only an idealized European identity, but the teleological trajectory of civilization as such. To cite Casanova once more, the West simply showed the future of the rest of the world. So now I want to talk about the conceptual displacement. That's the broad brushstrokes of what we mean by normative secularism. I now want to discuss the displacement of normative secularism. So in summary, normative secularism is an account of what the social should and will look like as processes of modernization take hold. On a normatively secular account, the modern social will be structured around a discrete division between the religious and the secular, the former identified with the personal, private, and irrational, or at least the non-rational, while the latter is the sphere of public activities such as politics. This narrative has sustained heavy criticism in recent years from a number of quarters and for a number of reasons. The most significant of these has been the so-called religious resurgence that we've already introduced. As Hurd suggests, critical reevaluation of normative secularism owes not simply to theoretical interests. That is, it's not a bunch of academics who have nothing better to do than to throw into doubt this whole theory that has structured the modern understanding of the social, but it owes to concrete socio-political realities. quoting her, "The problem of how religion fits with politics has become a significant topic not because it was identified as theoretically important, but because real-world events forced it back into the consciousness of international relations theorists. It has now become impossible to maintain that religion is irrelevant to international outcomes, as most conventional accounts would have it." End quote. This brings us back to the significance of the Iranian Revolution. From the perspective of Western political theory and international relations, the Iranian Revolution provides the exemplar of a world event forcing a critical reevaluation of normative secularism. I previously noted Linsowski's point that the political laws of the 20th century blinded political and international relations theorists to the significance of religion, and we can now see that those political laws are normatively secular in orientation. In other words, it is, in large measure, normative secularism that has blinded political and international relations theorists to the significance of religion as a social and political force. So having examined the narrative normative secularism, we can now go further. Social developments such as the Iranian Revolution conceptually displace this narrative. While I've drawn our attention to the Iranian Revolution owing to its significance, and maybe because of this anniversary coming up, we can consider numerous other examples as well. Examples such as the rise of solidarity in the Polish Revolution, the events of September 11, 2001, are some of the most obvious examples. We could also highlight the ongoing significance of the religious right in American politics and the rise of so-called Hindu nationalism in India, not to mention the sectarian violence plaguing Iraq following U.S.-led invasion, Muslim-Christian conflict in the Balkans, or now in Central African Republic. Summing up the issue, Berger notes that, quote, "The world today, with some exceptions, is as furiously religious as it ever was, and in some places more so than ever. The emergence and persistence of socio-political phenomena such as these have conceptually displaced normative secularism." And something to maybe talk about during the Q&A, I take this as an accomplished fact. I'm not arguing for this conceptual displacement. I'm not saying that we should think about it differently. I'm arguing that, in fact, normative secularism simply is no longer a compelling way of thinking about the social. As multiple analyses spurred by events such as these have demonstrated, the narrative of normative secularism is theoretically unfounded on numerous levels. More than simply highlighting a theoretical blind spot, these socio-political phenomena actively call normative secularism into question. In one of the more prescient analyses following the Iranian Revolution, Lacour notes that the recent political revival of religion will certainly be a factor of considerable importance for years to come. This has proven to be true, not just of Islam, but of the numerous other examples I noted a moment ago. As Peter Berger notes, the upsurge of distinctly religious political articulations is a feature of the contemporary world discernible in all major religious traditions. The emergence of religion as a potent geopolitical force, so readily on display in the Iranian Revolution, has proven to be neither short-lived nor anomalous. While it is a mistake to think that religion ever simply ceased to play a role in politics, it's another misnomer of the religious resurgence, as if religion sort of disappeared for a while, then came back. It nevertheless remains the case that there has been an increase in the scope and intensity of the politicization of religion around the world in recent decades. Berger highlights the significance of this for our understanding of normative secularism, writing that, quote, "Taken together, they," these diverse religio-political movements, "provide massive falsification of the idea that modernization and secularization are cognate phenomena." And again, this is noteworthy because Berger was one of the people who first articulated the thesis that these things were linked. Berger here draws our attention to a crucial dimension of the conceptual displacement of normative secularism, the sundering of the equivalence of secularism and modernization. Numerous scholars have now suggested that modernization does not necessarily imply secularization. As S.N. Eisenstadt famously suggests, post-World War II developments, such as those we've been considering, quote, "have refuted the homogenizing and hegemonic assumptions that the cultural program of modernity, as it took shape in Europe, represented a global or universal model of modernization. In contrast to this model, which so greatly informs modernization theory, Eisenstadt proposes a model of multiple modernities, according to which the contemporary world is to be viewed not in the binary terms of modern and traditional societies, but, in his words, as a story of continual constitution and reconstitution of a multiplicity of cultural programs that express modernity in multiple and unique ways. Thus, even if movements in non-Western societies are articulated in strongly anti-modern terms, they nevertheless remain distinctively modern. And there I'm suggesting that even when many of these groups identify themselves as anti-modern, they are in fact very modern in their presentation. S. Said argues that Islamism cannot be understood as a form of tradition or archaism standing in contrast to modernity. With specific reference to the Iranian Revolution, he writes that the conflicts concerning secularization within Islamic contexts do not represent conflicts between modern politics and traditional belief, but instead represent a conflict about which type of modernization strategy to pursue, rather than a conflict about whether or not to modernize. Along the same lines, the historian Reinhard Schulze notes that the Islamist political thought that culminated in the Iranian Revolution represents a marked and distinctly modern shift that took place in Islamic thought in the 1970s. All of these considerations highlight, as Dale Eichelman points out, that the secular bias of modernization theory has had a significant role in deflecting attention away from the role of religious practices and values in contemporary societies. Elizabeth Shackman Hurd, once again, highlights the significance of this with relation to secularism and again deserves quotation at length. She writes, "The increasing presence of religious phenomena, identities, and actors in international relations is not merely a protest against modernization, a retreat to archaic traditional forms of political order, or a backlash against global modernity, authenticity, and development. What is defined as religious resurgence is actually a political contestation that signals the disruption of pre-existing standards of what religion is and how it relates to politics. This apparent resurgence is evidence of the unsettling of convention and the eruption of fundamental contention over the relationship between metaphysics and politics that calls into question foundational secularist divisions between the secular and the religious." Much more than flash in the pan flare-ups of traditional and or irrational anti-modern passion, then, political phenomena such as the Iranian Revolution represent a fundamental contestation of secularism itself. They highlight that modern forms of secularism, like modern forms of nationalism, are made rather than found. What Hurd highlights is the increasing recognition that the articulation of religion is something essentially distinct from politics, and the secular is already political in nature. Categories such as religion, politics, and the secular are not mere social facts, but historical constructions. As Talal Assad sums up the issue, the categories of politics and religion turn out to implicate each other much more profoundly than we thought. As a body of scholarship that by now represents something of a cottage industry as repeatedly demonstrated, distinctions such as religion, state, secular, politics, and so on, as they are presently used, did not exist prior to the 19th century. Summing up the findings of such research, William Connolly writes that far from being trans-historical, the idea of religion has a history, and adds that there was a time when religion, as modern people use the term, was not, and then it was invented. The point to which Kavanaugh alerts us is that religion is not simply a descriptive category, and in view of the co-constitutive nature of the concept, similar considerations hold for the notion of the secular. The secular, of course, is an irreducibly relative term defined only in relation to some concept of religion. The concept of the secular, therefore, shares the same history of invention as that of religion. As Assad puts it, secularism as political doctrine arose in modern Euro-America. So, I've laid all that out. Coming to a conclusion, where do these reflections leave us? And hopefully that's what everyone's wondering. Where are we going with this? Where do these reflections leave us? I want to suggest a couple of conclusions and pose a number of questions that follow from them. And I pretend to make no pretense of answering these adequately. Hopefully that'll give us some grist for Q&A. The first suggestion is simply a reiteration of a point I've made a number of times. The emergence and persistence of socio-political movements of global significance, articulated in explicitly religious terms, have conceptually displaced normative secularism. And the second is that any definition of religion, and by implication of the secular, is already a political definition. The category of religion and of its place in the social is always already a question of politics. Religion is politics. And now a number of significant questions open from these points. And as I say, maybe this will give something to talk about in the Q&A. More than simply providing an account of the place of religion in society, normative secularism provides an account of the nature of the social as such. It represents a social ontology. The significance of normative secularism's conceptual displacement is that this ontology of the social is displaced, which in turn requires that we rethink the very nature and structure of the social as such. How then do we think the structure of the social after normative secularism, and how in particular do categories such as the religious and the secular relate to the social? The second question that arises is, with this conceptual displacement, does anything go when it comes to the role of religion in the social? Does it become impossible to make judgments about the role of religion? Must we accept all public and political religious expressions as legitimate? This question represents something of a relativist concern, relating the presumed linkage of secularism and reason. Just as many worry that we necessarily fall into relativism if we abandon notions of universal reason, so the concern arises that the displacement of normative secularism undercuts any possibility of evaluating public or political religious expression. While we obviously can't attempt to answer these questions fully here, I do want to be clear that in my view, relativism follows neither from the recognition that all appeals to reason are situated, nor from the conceptual displacement of normative secularism. But I think this is potentially the biggest concern that people have when you start talking about this displacement. Can we evaluate the Taliban? Can we evaluate Sharia law? Can we evaluate, it's always Islam that worries us. As I say, I don't have time to address these issues further, but perhaps these indications will give us something to talk about. Thank you.
You alluded to actually the same kind of upswelling of religious feeling in politics in the United States as well as in places like the Middle East and Iran, etc. So I guess my question is, given that that's just a different religion or a different sect of different religions, do you have any sense of how that the movement that you're talking about could actually be happening in the United States easily as much as in places
You know, more
like
violent
Iran?
form? Or,
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm not wanting to be.
You're not trying to be alarmist or anything. Yeah, right.
No.
Right. No, in the broad sense, yes, and it is. The narrow sense, I'm not predicting anything necessarily. I don't know that it's going to go that direction. I do think there's value to having a system that builds in sort of what pressure release valves, right? As I think a democratic society can do when it sort of works right, when it works the way we kind of want it to. But I can easily see that. I mean, who can't imagine? I read too much dystopian fiction. Right. Not to see that. I think it can. I mean, one of my views, sort of theoretical assumptions of this, is I see the structure of the social as, I see the social is only what social actors make of it. I don't think that the way that the social takes shape is a reflection of deeper rationality or teleological historical movements or something like that. So I think it's contingent. It doesn't necessarily mean arbitrary, right? Certain historical events sort of open some possibilities and close off others. But absolutely, I think it's conceivable that any existing social formation could be disrupted and could take that kind of direction. You know, I think it's naive not to, if you look at how brief, you know, our sort of modern constitutional liberal states are in sort of world history. I think it'd be naive to think that they couldn't pass away or that ours couldn't pass away or be threatened in some way. So I mean, I think it's conceivable. I don't know if that gets at what you're asking or not.
Yeah.
What do you think about the possibility of, sorry, come back to me. I'm trying to find the word.
Yeah.
This is perhaps going to sound a bit base, but do you think that there's any value left in secularism, given that, I mean...
So it's a great question, right? And it just gets more complicated.
Mm-hmm.
That was complicated enough. It just gets more complicated. What I'm talking about here is what I call this normative secularism. And it's this notion that essentially says to be secular is essentially to be more rational and more a reflection of rationality or reason than to be non-secular. And that has been the way that a lot of modern Western nation states have developed and so forth. In the book, or the would-be book, I actually contrast it with what I call conventional secularism. That is, I think it's one thing to say that those of us who are secular are in fact more rational than all the people who aren't secular and so forth. And something we didn't even get into is the role that this language of secularism has played in Western colonialism and things like that as well. It's, you know, it's going and civilizing other pre-modern people and so on. But I think that there can be a notion of what I call conventional secularism. That is a secularism that recognizes itself as merely a social convention, right? A secularism that might say, for example, all things being equal, we think a social space in which people can't be killed for their religious beliefs is better than one in which they can. I think where that's different, that may not sound like much of a difference, but where I think it's different when I call it normative secularism is I think we own and recognize the fact that that is itself a contingent political articulation of the social. Or putting it a different way, if you want to use the language of neutrality, that's how a lot of Western countries tend to think about religion, right? The state is supposed to be neutral with regard to religion as long as you don't harm others and so forth. There's nothing neutral about neutrality, right? It's a highly political, highly partisan stance to take to say we will treat all religious people on a kind of equal level, which will mean that it may infringe rights of expression of some or the way that some religious people might want to express themselves and so forth. So I think that there is room for secularism. I think we just can't fall into the trap of thinking that being secular, we're simply being more rational than everybody else and the problems that poses. So I think, and that's what I call conventional secularism. There's a guy out of Princeton named Jeffrey Stout who argues this for a kind of pragmatic conception. And he sort of argues and says, you know, when the secularists give these grandiose historical accounts of where secularism comes from, he says they just misunderstand themselves. Right? Just figure out that in a pluralistic, multicultural society like ours, you'll get more done if you can build coalitions with a wider range of people, which means that if you don't make dividing points about religion, you'll get more done. That's his understanding of secularism, is that it's a sort of pragmatic effect of a pluralistic society. Right? So that's one example of a non-normative form of secularism. So I think that there is still room for a conception of secularism, divested of those kind of rationalist pretensions. Sorry, did that answer your question?
Yes.
So do you think there could be some sort of secular backlash against the more recent religious movements, sort of?
Sure,
like
yeah.
what
I mean,
happened in
all you
Turkey?
need to do to find secular backlashes, in my opinion, are look at some European concerns about immigration and the kind of xenophobic fear. It's always, in the European context, it's always the fear of Muslims coming in. But I think also France. I mean, the laws in France, which is the most sort of militant, sort of rational, Enlightenment-based form of secularism, known as laicism or laicite, where they ban any public wearing of like religious symbols and so forth, whether it be crosses or yarmulkes or head coverings or whatever. So there certainly are and have been secularist backlashes, which I also think is problematic. So I think that just puts a backlash. It just invites a backlash in the other direction.
It's just provoking.
Yeah.
That was good comments on that. Switzerland just, no, actually Sweden, just very reluctantly passed immigration queues on, or rather quotas on immigration due to the issue you just stated. There are political parties in the UK that have their single issue parties regarding that entirely.
Yeah, you get. I mean, it always codes with other things, right? So you've always got secularism, but you have xenophobia generally. It's usually heavily racially coded, right? It's typically brown people from other parts of the world that we're worried about coming into our countries, not light-skinned people, right? So these things map on, but yeah, yeah. I heard about that today as well. This close vote they had.
You had mentioned relativism and the idea, of course, that there are many, many religious expressions in the world, but also perhaps many secular expressions as well. And so is there a sense in which relativism becomes, in a way, the fundamental problem, in the sense that a religious activity being in control of politics or with politics is okay as long as it's mine.
Right.
I mean, I think that's one of the issues that's been stated here in the United States, where there have been people who have said that it's a terrible thing that Islam, especially the Shia form of Islam in Iran, should control the politics of that country, and yet at the same time saying, maybe on the same day, that a form of Christian religion should control how we govern ourselves in the United States, which seems obviously pretty inconsistent.
Yeah, it is. I think there are a number of things. Right? I mean, you do have people of not just religious worldviews, but what John Rawls would call comprehensive philosophical perspectives, who really believe that what they believe or hold to the nature, reality, and so forth is simply true, right? And everybody else is wrong. But you get other layers. I don't know if this is exactly what you're going for, but Heard, whom I cited a number of times, she develops, or doesn't develop, but lays out the development of two sort of different models of secularism. One is the sort of French model, that the straight Enlightenment, religion's irrational, needs to be kept out of the rational public space, and so forth. The other one she calls Judeo-Christian secularism. And that's a certain discourse that really has roots in the US, and people like Bernard Lewis or others, right? This notion that there's something built into Christianity that is actually more tolerant than any other religion and so forth. And so that part and parcel of the US being a so-called Christian nation or having its roots in Judeo-Christianity is that we somehow are better suited to be secular and affirming of others than, again, in his case, specifically Islam. Which I think, if you look at it historically, Christianity is, to say a checkered past and being, pluralistic and inviting would be the least. But it is one way that these, again, as you're saying, all these complex forms take shape that you can't capture with any one sort of theoretical category or term.
Would you accept a couple of comments regarding your speech?
Sure.
I trust you have not been in Iran and you do not speak Persian. I am Iranian, maybe the only Iranian here, and I lived through the revolution, followed it, was involved, affected, etc. You made a comment that the United States had no idea what was going on before the revolution.
Policy analysts in the U.S. and intelligence community in the U.S. did not anticipate the Iranian Revolution.
I want to tell you this is wrong.
Okay.
And I am sorry that your student left, and let me explain to you why they knew. I was in Iran 1974 working for a U.S. project, for a U.S. government project, and I did some studies as to how to improve voter registration system of Iran.
Okay.
Under the Shah. I returned as the officer of Chase Manhattan Bank in 1975, found absolutely, completely different Iran than 2 years before. And my function to Iran second time was to get permission, establish Chase Manhattan Bank in Iran. And I went every place to find out what caused the difference. And the best analysis of the difference was from U.S. Embassy, your economists, and your political attaché in Iran. What was happening, they knew inside out, and they were frightened, and they had informed every individual in the State Department, weekly memos as to what was happening. Unfortunately, the people in the White House and upper either never read them, never treated them, and I know the same exact situation happened before America attacked Iraq. They were State Department. Then I went and I studied as to, based on US input and few others, I knew things are happening really radically, real badly. I changed our strategy about investment, reduced it, ownership reduced it, and by 79, of course, it was obvious. People in the government, State Department were aware and more aware, and your CIA were more aware than anybody else, and if you had met them, they would tell you. Unfortunately, those who made the decision in the White House, after never listened, never read, never indicated. You cannot say that U.S. was unaware of what happened. U.S. was, but somebody neglected.
Let me restate. Okay? When I say the U.S., I mean the White House. I mean the people in the U.S. who had the authority to actually respond to the situation, to make policy. You're right, and there were wars. I cite Brzezinski, right? Brzezinski was on one side of this, and he was battling with people, and according to most analyses, he did a lot to really try to push Carter. He wanted an armed intervention to put down the uprising and so forth. So, of course, if you're talking about an apparatus as significant as thousands of U.S. Foreign Service officials, some of them, yes, some of them did. But what I mean, and I'm sorry if I misspoke by saying the USNC, is that the policy makers, the ones who are setting policy, the one who could have responded to it, didn't. And most analyses I've read do say that the CIA certainly didn't seem to anticipate that it was going to happen. And nobody was speaking very much about the specifically religious dimension. Though it started to build thing, there were some people telling Carter that he should reach out to Khomeini, that he should talk to him, and there was a lot of debate about doing that. So there were undercurrents, but I guess the point I'm making is they remained undercurrents. They remained ineffective.
That's another point. I don't take the time here because there may be other questions. But another point that I think you should know, that the Shah of Iran, before departing, he had known what was happening there, and he knew that U.S. was no longer trusted him because he had opposed many of U.S. policies. And he knew that what was happening was taking place, and he would have no support of U.S., CIA, FBI, or any of the
Sure.
other.
I mean, he wouldn't have abdicated if he did, right? I mean, he wouldn't have left and not
That's
come
right. He
back.
would not have.
No.
He would not. He did. The other choice would have been having thousands of people killed.
Right, which is
almost,
exactly
and
what Brzezinski
he
wanted to do.
decided absolutely. He decided not to do. So he did not lose the trust of U.S. U.S. neglected him because he had opposed some of the policies of the United States, you know, in the Middle East, etc., and they had really stopped liking him, supporting him, and they wanted to repeat the same thing that happened 1950, during the Mossadegh, etc., etc. So that was another issue that I think people ought to know. U.S. had suddenly dropped their support of the best friend they had in the Middle East because he stopped following U.S. mandates and followed U.S. policies.
Good. Thank you.
That was all.
So this was the first chapter of your book, right? And I'm curious, and you've laid out your thesis. Where do you go from here?
Yeah, where I go, the first chapter is this. The second, or the next three chapters, I look at three very different ways of rethinking the social structure. One is the political theology of a guy named Graham Ward, theological political movement called radical orthodoxy, he proposes. I look at the theory of Jürgen Habermas, well-known political theorist, and specifically he's sort of taking things what he calls a post-secular direction. And then the neo-Marxist theory of Antonio Hart and Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, and what they do. And for various reasons, I suggest, as you do in books, that their stuff doesn't work. And in the second half, I lay out my stuff. And I try to argue that, understood in a certain way, we can view the structuring of the social as inherently political, by which I mean that it doesn't reflect a deeper rationality and so forth, that it is simply the political articulation. And so politics, the political isn't simply one element of society. And then I also argue that viewed in a certain way, that a specifically sort of radical and plural democratic structuring of the social can also be viewed as a kind of religious structuring of the social, in the sense of being a kind of affirmation of that which is always coming, which various continental philosophers describe in terms of sort of the messianic and things like this. So that viewed in a certain way, the social can be seen as irreducibly religious and political, with our more ordinary terms of politics and religion as sort of constituted subcategories within that. So that's sort of what I'm attempting to do. Oh, thank you. Sorry.
Your account of the rise and fall of normative secularism, you've denied that the return of religion was anti-modernist reaction. And given that, do you have any account of any explanation for the historical change in the latter half of the 20th century between secularism and
a lot of
increased
people would,
importance?
I'm sorry, you're asking for why these movements become sort of more prominent, or a better way of saying it is a book called The New Visibility of Religion.
Why did religion return to public life if it wasn't
a lot of them,
anti-modernist?
especially, and I keep going to Islamism because it's one of the things that I know more about than I do some other things. But one of them certainly with Islamism, or many would suggest that sort of the failed promises of kind of modernization and so forth. You had in Iran and other places, you had the U.S. and Western powers, but by the post-war period, it's primarily the U.S. saying, if you secularize and modernize and so forth, essentially you're going to get the social benefits, the economic benefits and so forth that the modern West and the U.S. has had and so forth. But the shape that actually took, partly because of the Cold War, was the U.S. often supporting or installing authoritarian regimes, anti-democratic regimes that were sort of skimming off the top to neglect of the people and so forth. And one reason that there's a particular scholar like, I don't know his first name. His book is S. Said, and everybody calls him Bobby Said. I don't know what the S stands for. But he suggests, and I think this is interesting, that essentially with the kind of failure of liberalism to work, this kind of enforced liberalization to deliver on the promises. And equally, from the perspective of lots of parts of the world, the failure of communism, right? Those in the Cold War world like to think of East and West, but for many outside of the big players, they were both Western, and they were both sort of Western impositions. That in many of these places, Islam in particular was a kind of tradition to which people could reach to try to articulate some vision of the social and the political in terms other than those offered by these dominant political paradigms. And that this is part of the role that religious traditions play. And I think you could look at it, not the American religious right so much, because it's really sort of absorbed a lot of those, but aspects of, as I say, Hindu nationalism in some places, Catholicism in some, the Polish Revolution in certain ways, reaching to a certain notion of Catholicism instead of straightforward, sort of anti-communist liberalism and so on. It provided a kind of alternative discourse and alternative set of resources for developing a political language, I think was at least one reason.
How would you account for the American religious right then? Would you say the same process as it worked within America?
No, I wouldn't, because I think the American religious right in many ways has sort of internalized some of the key components of liberalism. And of course, liberalism, I don't mean like Democrats versus Republicans, sort of broad political structuring. So for example, there's a sociologist named, fittingly, Christian Smith, who does work on American evangelicalism and shows, for example, American evangelicalism and the religious right so much is actually more individualistic and oftentimes more capitalistic than the majority American society. So in a certain sense, the American religious right in many ways has incorporated many of those things to a fuller extent. In some ways, it's even a radicalization of some of those. So I don't think it's arisen as a rejection in quite the way that even the religious right might think that it has.
Do you go into that in your book?
No, I don't. No, I don't. I would like to, I don't.
Second book?
Yeah, second book.
You brought up a very interesting question, which was the, and I don't go into it in the book, but just a question on your views on this. You mentioned the sort of higher individualism of the religious right. I honestly don't see much of that. They pay lip service to a lot, at least in discourse, but in policies that are put out by them, they seem to be almost the exact opposite.
I think it's social policies are. Economics, they're free market. They tend to be free market. They tend to be free market economists. They think the state should be imposed. Tend to be small. And also I'm thinking theologically in terms of understanding the nature of Christianity, the nature of salvation, and so forth.
And they probably
highly
individualized.
individualized.
They found out that like Milton Friedman was an agnostic or something.
Maybe, but they would like Friedman's economics quite a bit.
Right.
Typically, right? There's always exceptions.
Is there any sense that the response to colonialism, anti-colonial feelings in places like India or even all through the Middle East are the same things that would, you lump these things together and say the response or the return to some of the indigent religions are an alternative to what's been placed upon us by a colonial power. And I think it's interesting that the Middle East has had to respond to modernity, however it's defined, and the end of colonialism, and our modern political activities in relationship to things like the internet, et cetera, all at once, whereas we've done this in the United States over a period of time. And it's a much more difficult transition for them to make than it might have been.
Yeah, I'm not any kind of expert sort of modernization policies. It seems to me one of the big mistakes that people have made is, again, sort of neglecting exactly what you're saying. It took a couple hundred years, right, to kind of work out some of these kinks and things. And then we're shocked when other countries can't have them imposed from above in a relatively short period of time.
Because in a way, I mean, the American experience in Iraq is in fact colonialism in another way. I mean, because we're saying we're going to give you your political system that we have, and you will like it. And that obviously is not probably going to work very well.
Well, yeah, it hasn't worked out very well so far. Right?
I was wondering if you could talk maybe, I don't know what question to ask, but if you could talk about how the civil rights movement and influence that religion had.
Yeah, briefly. I mean, it's one of the things, I teach world religions class and ask students to define religion and things like that. And often people have a notion that religion is just sort of either two views. Either religion is peaceful and great and everything that religion does is sort of sweetness and light and we would all get along if we were religious. Or that religion's inherently violent and every bad thing that happens on the planet is because of religion. I tend to think it's a very mixed bag. And so when students come up with either of those, I often suggest, on a secularist model, could the civil rights movement have happened? On a strictly secularist model, if you really took religion out of the public square, would you have the civil rights movement? I don't think that you would. I mean, you have an ordained minister starting this and talking about, I have a dream and biblical imagery and preaching. That's why he was such a good speaker. He was a really good preacher, right? If you took religion out of that, would you have the civil rights movement in the U.S.? I don't think so. I don't think you would have the abolition movement. But there are negative things as well that you might have. So I think it's a knife that cuts both ways. I don't think that religion or religious expression is any one thing, positive or negative. But to get to your specific question or point about the civil rights movement, I think religion's absolutely vital. I don't think you have the American religious rights movement without a strongly religious component, and in our case, it was a Christian component. I think it would have been very different to be. I don't even know where you would look, actually. Even Malcolm X was on the Islamic, a certain kind of African American Islamic expression. So that was underlying that. So if you were to try to write religion out of it, I don't know what you'd have left, honestly. Yeah.
Back to what you said about how religion was important to the civil rights movement. I just had a hard time buying that because you look at other civil rights movements such as the women's suffragette movement or just equal rights for women, which didn't really have any religious basis but was still successful. I know that's very different from the African American civil rights movement in the U.S., but at the same time, I just don't know. I just don't really think that it's fair to go and make a statement saying that religion is inherently a key factor in something like civil rights in the United States. It was just a factor in this instance, which was result.
It's a fair point. So I'll restate and say, again, to reaffirm that religion isn't one thing. And with the question I had in mind, right, specifically concern for African American rights.
Yeah.
But you're right, it hasn't, I mean, the bigger example than the suffragettes is the gay rights movement, right? Which by and large, the largest, most vocal, most socially significant religious factors in the U.S. have not been allies, right, of the LGBTQ community in their fight. So just to reiterate that point, that I'm not suggesting that you have to have religion for social things to happen or that's inherently liberative. It can cut lots of different ways. And again, when I was responding to her comment, I wasn't meaning to equate all forms of civil rights, but it's a good point. There are counterexamples to that. I'm either incredibly luminous or everybody's tired.